My name is Nora. I'm 31 years old. The first sound was the copier. Low, mechanical, patient. It started up before sunrise behind a frosted glass door in a downtown Portland law office, humming like the building itself had already clocked in before the people inside it had fully become human. Rain whispered against the tall front windows. Somewhere deeper in the suite, somebody set down a mug a little too hard. The lobby smelled like burnt coffee, printer toner, old carpet, and the lemony wax they used on the reception desk to make everything shine like nobody in that building had ever lied for money. Then came the second sound, a single envelope sliding across polished wood. The receptionist pushed it toward me with 2 fingers. Heavy cream paper, my full name typed in black ink, no handwritten note. No sorry, no please, no pretense of warmth, just the kind of formal silence rich people pay other people to mail for them. 5 years. That was how long it had been since I had heard one word from my parents. No calls, no texts, no birthday card, no accidental voicemail, no holiday message pretending everybody had grown and healed. Nothing. 5 full years of being erased so neatly it almost felt clerical. I picked up the envelope and felt the paper inside. Not a stack. One document. Maybe 2 pages. That told me a lot. Whatever they wanted it to land clean, quick, efficient, like a knife that expected not to miss. The receptionist cleared her throat. Mr. Wexler asked that you read it before leaving. I looked at her. Asked, I repeated. She shifted in her chair, already regretting the sentence. Oh, that's what he said. I nodded once and walked to the seating area near the front window. The leather chair was colder than it looked. Outside, Portland was still half asleep under a sheet of gray rain, brake lights dragging red across wet pavement, people hurrying past with coffee cups and their shoulders up against the cold. Inside, everything felt too still, too polished, too careful. Like even the silence had gone through legal review. I slid one finger under the seal and opened the envelope. Thick paper. Raised letterhead. Wexler and Bain. Family Estates and Trust Administration. Then the title. Notice of Beneficial Interest Termination and Property Clarification. I read the first paragraph once, then again, then slower. By the middle of page 2, I started laughing. Not softly, not politely. Not the kind of laugh that asks permission. I laughed hard enough that the receptionist looked up, then looked down again so fast it was almost respectful. I laughed because the sentence they had sent to scare me was so smug, so careful, and so catastrophically stupid that I could actually feel the lie under it. For 5 years, I had imagined 1,000 versions of what their silence meant. That I had been thrown away, that I had never mattered, that the family machine had closed ranks and moved on beautifully without me, that whatever version of home they kept performing for everyone else was running just fine with my absence edited out. But there it was, in black ink. Their lawyer informing me that any presumed equitable claim I believed I retained regarding the Hawthorne property associated trust assets and deferred sale proceeds had no basis because I had voluntarily abandoned occupancy and family affiliation in August of 2019. Family affiliation, I laughed again, because people do not use a phrase like that unless they are trying to replace facts with posture, and because I knew the problem before I even reached the signature block. August of 2019 was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not close enough to argue over. Wrong in the kind of way that wrecks everything if the person reading it knows where to look. The receptionist stood halfway, uncertain. Ma'am, are you all right? I held up the paper. Did he actually send this? Her face did that little freeze people do when they realize the room they're standing in has suddenly become expensive in a different way. I'm not authorized to discuss client documents. Good, I said. Because this one just confessed to something. I folded the paper carefully, very carefully, put it back in the envelope, stood up, smoothed my coat. My hands were steady. My breathing was steady. The laugh had burned through something old in me, something sour, something I had been carrying so long I no longer noticed the weight. 5 years earlier, that envelope would have destroyed my whole day, maybe my whole month. 5 years earlier, one legal notice from my parents would have turned me back into a daughter before I even finished reading it. I would have looked for hope between the lines. I would have mistaken contact for care. I would have read every word with that humiliating little hunger people like them train into you. But 5 years teaches strange skills, how to live inside unanswered questions, as how to survive without closure, how to stop begging polished liars to become plain-spoken just because you are hurting. Silence trains your hearing. I wrote that line down later. Silence trains your hearing. I left the law office and crossed the street in the rain without opening my umbrella. My apartment was 15 minutes away on the east side, third floor, one bedroom, over a nail salon and a tax preparer, with sun-faded red lettering in the window. I had signed that lease during the worst month of my life. Thin walls, bad plumbing, random notices taped by the mailboxes downstairs that never seemed to apply to anyone. The upstairs hallway always smelled faintly like dryer sheets and somebody else's dinner. It was also the first place I had ever lived where every single object inside belonged to me. Not curated by my mother, and not paid for by my father and therefore treated like leverage. Mine. I let myself in, hung my wet coat over the back of a kitchen chair, and set the envelope on the counter. The kettle clicked on. The apartment smelled like lemon dish soap, damp wool, and the takeout noodles I had eaten too late the night before. My Walmart receipt was still beside a bag of clementines and a tube of toothpaste I had forgotten to put away. Ordinary things, cheap things, proof of a life nobody had handed me. When the kettle clicked off, I made tea and read the document again, this time slower. Then I went to the hall closet and pulled out the gray plastic storage bin I had not opened in months. Tax returns, old notebooks, a cracked phone, one baby photo I had taken from the house years ago, mail, loose receipts, and in every scrap of paper I had saved from the summer my parents removed me from their family with the polished precision of event planners canceling a vendor. My parents were not loud people. That mattered. Some families detonate in public. Mine specialized in immaculate destruction. My mother, Elise, could humiliate you while straightening a centerpiece. My father, Grant, believed open anger was tacky. He preferred disappointment. It traveled farther. It made the other person collapse for him. He never had to look messy if he could make you do the unraveling yourself. They had raised me in Lake Oswego, just outside Portland, in a white house with black shutters, a curved front walk, and Christmas lights so symmetrical every December that strangers slowed down to admire them. My father developed commercial property. And not skyscraper money, not celebrity money, worse, board seat money, fundraiser money, quiet influence money, the kind that decides who gets invited, who gets forgiven, and whose version of events becomes the official one before anybody else has finished speaking. My mother ran our home like a luxury brand. Thanksgiving looked staged. The 4th of July looked sponsored. Even our grief, when it happened, arrived arranged and fluffed and candlelit. Every table setting had backup candles. Every smile had a target. From the outside, we were polished, disciplined, community-minded, reliable. My mother chaired galas. My father sat on boards. They sent flowers, remembered anniversaries, donated publicly, spoke in complete sentences at all times. Inside the house, love was permission-based. I learned that early. My older brother Colin was the heir in a navy blazer. Easy smile, clean haircut, golf lessons, the right kind of lazy confidence. He looked correct in family photos and never seemed to notice how much more room he was allowed to take up. I was the daughter my mother described as sharp, usually right after I had asked a question nobody wanted asked, or failed to sound grateful enough for some decision made about my life without me. I was not dramatic. That was one of our family myths. I was observant. There's a difference. The first crack I noticed was not money. It was paperwork. I was 26 and still living in the carriage house behind the main property, because my mother preferred to call it a graceful transition arrangement instead of admitting they liked me close, useful, and economically easy to control. Dad, I worked part-time at a design studio downtown, picked up freelance branding work on the side, and kept being told how lucky I was not to be paying real Portland rent. One afternoon, I came in through the mudroom while my father and a man from his office were talking in the breakfast room. I was not eavesdropping. They simply never adjusted their voices around me anymore because they had stopped believing I counted. The man said, "If Nora signs the occupancy release with the rest, title cleanup stays simple." My father answered, "She won't need the details. Elise will handle her." I stopped where I was. Occupancy release. Title cleanup. Simple. That night at dinner, I asked, "What occupancy release?" My mother didn't blink. What are you talking about?" "The one Dad mentioned this afternoon." My father kept cutting his salmon. "You misunderstood business language." "No," I said. "I understood it fine." Colin looked at me over his wine glass with that familiar older brother expression, the one that always somehow meant, "Don't make this inconvenient for me." My mother said, "Nora, not everything in this house concerns you." I remember the smell of rosemary potatoes, the soft clink of silverware, the warm recessed lighting making everything look expensive and unreal. I said, "Then why does my name concern your lawyer?" My father set down his fork. "There are trust housekeeping matters. You do not need to worry about them." That was the first time I heard the word trust used like chloroform, 3 weeks later. But my mother sent me into the study for a notary stamp. The stamp was not what I found. There was a folder on the desk, not hidden, not locked. My father had always believed intimidation was cleaner than actual security. Inside were property records, trust references, and a transfer summary tied to the Hawthorne property, which was not our main house, but a smaller duplex in Selwood that had belonged to my grandmother, Ruth Hawthorne. My grandmother did not trust appearances. That made her dangerous in our family. She used to say, "Pretty people still forge signatures." When I was younger, I thought it was just one of her sharp little jokes. Later, I realized she almost never joked by accident. The duplex mattered to me because I had spent half my childhood there with her after school. She let me sit on the kitchen counter and drink ginger ale from a jelly jar while she paid bills and muttered about taxes and city nonsense and people who confused polish with character. She told me once, very plainly, that I would always have a roof somewhere no one can talk you out of. At 26, I still thought she meant that emotionally. The folder suggested otherwise. There was a trust amendment, a draft occupancy release, a transfer summary, and clipped to the front page, in my mother's handwriting, a note. "Need Nora signed before recording." I took pictures of everything on my phone. Then I made the mistake daughters like me always make the first time. I confronted them before I had enough. I should have waited. I didn't. My mother received me in the library with her hands folded in her lap and her ankles crossed, like I had interrupted a room already prepared to outlast me. My father stood by the bar cart with one hand in his pocket. Colin had been summoned too, which meant they wanted a witness who would later describe me as emotional. I set the copied pages on the coffee table. "What is this?" My mother looked down at them like they were restaurant menus. "Private documents." "Why is my grandmother's duplex in a trust amendment I was never told about?" My father said, "Because it is being managed." "Managed by whom?" "Hawthorne Family Trust Administration." "There is no Hawthorne Family Trust," I said. At least none I was ever told existed. My mother gave me the exact same expression she used when a waiter brought the wrong vintage. "Nora," she said, "your grandmother's affairs were handled years ago." "No!" "These dates are recent." My father stepped in then. "Recent cleanup. Clerical." "Then why do you need me to sign something?" His jaw shifted. Tiny movement. But in my father, truth always arrived there first. Colin sighed. "Can we not turn this into a production?" I looked at him. "You're in this too, aren't you?" He rolled his eyes. "It's property administration, not a conspiracy." I still remember the smell of whiskey when my father came closer. "You went through private files. I found evidence my name is attached to something you are hiding from me. You found paperwork you do not understand." That sentence became the anthem of that week. Paperwork you do not understand. Tone you do not understand. Boundaries you do not understand. The family specialty was always the same. Hide the act. Attack the reaction. By the end of the week, my key code had been changed. By the end of the month, I had a letter from their attorney instructing me to vacate the carriage house. The wording was elegant enough to frame. Temporary residential privilege rescinded, voluntary departure expected, no claim of tenancy recognized. I packed my things into my Honda while neighbors pretended not to watch. My mother did not come outside. My father watched from the kitchen window. Colin texted me once. "You pushed too hard." That was his version of events. Not that they had hidden documents, not that they had rushed me out, not that they had started moving pieces around my grandmother's property before I even understood the board. No. According to my family, my crime was pressure. I had made private deceit emotionally inconvenient. And in houses like the one I grew up in, that counts as violence. The first 6 months after that were survival. Address change, new phone plan, side jobs, freelance work, frozen dinners, budget spreadsheets, learning how to stretch groceries, learning how to sign my own lease, learning how to stop flinching every time an unknown number called. I learned something else too. Family silence distorts time. At first, every day feels like a statement. Then it becomes weather. 5 years passed that way. I built a freelance design business the boring, unglamorous way. Small clients first, then slightly steadier contracts. Packaging work for a skincare startup that paid late. Branding for a coffee roaster in Bend. Menu design for a restaurant that changed owners twice in 1 year. Social assets, retainers, revisions, tax headaches. Client red flags, scope creep. The weird freedom of never having to ask my father for anything again. I got better. Not healed, better. There's a difference there too. The wound stayed, buried, and buried wounds still shape the body. I wrote that down later too. I never fully let go of the Hawthorne property issue, but I did run out of proof. Every lawyer I could afford wanted more documents. Every search turned up half answers, outdated filings, or records that hinted at movement without giving me the full picture. My grandmother's probate had been quiet. Too quiet. No dramatic fight, no obvious theft, just a trail of neat administrative choices that somehow ended with me outside the family and the property somewhere I could no longer see. Then came the envelope. And with it, their first real mistake. I spread everything across my kitchen table that morning and lined up the dates. My grandmother died in March of 2018. I was still living on the main property through August of 2019. I had receipts, pay stubs, emails, photos. There was even a 4th of July picture from that year, with me on the back patio holding a paper plate, while my mother posed beneath string lights as if she had personally invented family warmth. But the Wexler notice said I had voluntarily abandoned occupancy and affiliation in August 2019, and therefore had no standing against subsequent trust administration actions. Subsequent. That word stopped me cold. If the actions were subsequent to my leaving, then the transfers had to come after August. But one of the grainy phone photos I had taken years earlier showed a date in June. June, not August. I dug the old broken phone out of the plastic bin, found the charger, and sat on the kitchen floor waiting for it to wake up like I was trying to revive a witness. It started slow, angry, fragmented. But it started. I found the hidden photo folder. There they were, blurry, crooked, badly lit. Still enough. June 14th, 2019. Transfer instruction draft. June 21st, 2019. Beneficiary occupancy release pending. June 28th, 2019. Interim title movement recommendation. I sat back against the cabinet and stared at the rain on the window. They had already been moving things before I left, which meant the notice they sent me now relied on a false sequence, not emotional shading, not family interpretation, a timeline lie, and timeline lies leave footprints. The next morning, I took the Max downtown to the Multnomah County Clerk's office. The building smelled like wet coats, old paper, copier heat, and civic exhaustion. I stood in line behind a contractor arguing about permit records and a woman with a stroller asking for a certified marriage copy. Normal life. That was the strange thing. Paperwork decides enormous things while the room around it keeps sounding ordinary. When I got to the counter, I requested archived property records tied to the Hawthorne duplex, the trust reference listed in the Wexler notice, and any deed transfers connected to my grandmother's estate. The clerk was a woman with silver nails and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain. She typed for a long time, stopped, scrolled back, typed again. Then she frowned. There's a cross-reference here to a probate matter and a later quiet title filing. Can I see both? If you want certified. Yes, there's a fee. I want everything I'm allowed to request. She looked at me over the glasses. That usually means trouble. It means I'm learning to read. That got the faintest almost smile. 2 hours later, I walked out with a thick folder and a receipt that hurt my feelings. The papers were still warm from the copier. I carried them to a coffee shop a few blocks away and spread them over a table in the corner. Not Starbucks. A local place with cracked leather booths, burnt espresso, and jazz low enough not to get in the way of thinking. By page 2, my hands went cold. There it was, a quiet title action filed the year before, tied to the Hawthorne property, referencing prior beneficiary waiver assumptions and administrative reliance on beneficiary non-participation. Not signed by me. Not acknowledged by me. It built partly on the idea that I had removed myself before certain decisions were made. Administrative reliance. Another phrase designed to perfume a mess. Then I found the probate cross-reference. My grandmother's will had indeed poured certain assets into a trust, but attached to the probate file was a handwritten codicil later validated by witness affidavit. One narrow paragraph, one very Ruth Hawthorne paragraph. It said that if either grandchild was displaced from family residence due to intra-family coercive exclusion, that grandchild retained a contingent occupancy and proceeds interest in the Hawthorne property until age 35 or voluntary notarized release. I read it 3 times. Voluntary notarized release, not verbal separation, not emotional estrangement, not silence, and not disappearing because the people with the locks had more power than you did. Voluntary, notarized, release. I had signed no such thing. I laughed again. Right there in the coffee shop. Not because it was over. Because now I could finally see the architecture. My grandmother had seen them coming. She had built a trap for exactly this kind of polished cruelty. A clause so specific it almost made me shiver. Intra-family coercive exclusion. That was Ruth. She never wasted language. If she chose those words, she chose them because she knew exactly who they were for. My parents had known. They had to have known. Which meant the 5 years of silence were not about forgetting me. They were about running out the clock while tiptoeing around a clause they could not erase. That realization changed my whole spine. And I stopped feeling abandoned. I started feeling handled, and handled people can do two things. They can stay scared, or they can get exact. The next week became an investigation. Not frantic, not dramatic, exact. I requested more records, paid for certified copies I could barely afford, made charts, lists, name columns, date columns, signatory columns. Who notarized what filing relied on which earlier assumption, what language was direct, what language was suspiciously vague. Then I started calling people. First, Marlene, my grandmother's old bookkeeper, 80, if she was a day, still living in Milwaukee, still answering the phone like every unknown caller had personally offended her. When I introduced myself, there was a pause. Then she said, I wondered when somebody smart would finally call. That nearly undid me. Not because it was tender, because it meant I was not imagining the shape of this. I drove to her condo with grocery store flowers and a box of tea biscuits. Her place smelled like lavender, old paperbacks, and radiator heat. She had my grandmother's kind of gaze. Not the same eyes. The same level stare. I told her about the Wexler notice, the dates, the codicil, the filings. When I finished, Marlene leaned back and said, "Your grandmother stopped trusting your mother near paperwork after 2017. Why?" She caught Elise trying to simplify a beneficiary designation. That was my mother's whole gift. Turn theft into efficiency. Turn cruelty into curation. Turn exclusion into concern. Marlene got up slowly, walked to a hallway cabinet, and came back with a manila folder. "I wasn't sure when the right time would be," she said. "Then they stopped speaking to you, and that made things clearer." Inside were copies of letters, notes, account summaries, correspondence my grandmother had given Marlene to keep. One note mentioned pressure from G&E to consolidate Hawthorne before Nora understands what they are doing. Another mentioned Colin behaving as if the property is already his, and scribbled in the margin of an account page, in my grandmother's handwriting, 6 words that made my whole throat tighten. If Nora is forced out, clause holds. Below that, remind counsel, which meant the lawyer's office had known too. That night I barely slept. Rain moved against the windows in soft bursts. Somewhere outside, a siren passed and faded, and I sat at my kitchen table under the weak overhead light, files spread around me, and understood something ugly and freeing at the same time. My parents had not cut me off because I was powerless. They cut me off because informed daughters are expensive. The next person I saw was an attorney, not family law. Estate litigation. A retired contact a design client connected me to through her uncle. I paid for 1 hour of consultation in cash and walked into his office with no desire to be soothed. I wanted to know whether I had grief or I had a case. His office overlooked the river. Diplomas on the wall. No soft lighting. No comfort language. I handed him the Wexler notice, the certified records, the codicil, Marlene's copies, and the old phone dates. He read in silence for 10 full minutes. Then he took off his glasses and said, "Oh, whoever sent this either assumed you would fold instantly, or they got sloppier than wealthy lawyers usually allow themselves to be. Do I have anything?" He gave me a look that held no false hope and a lot of respect. "You may have several things." He tapped the notice with his pen. "They are asserting that your rights terminated because of abandonment before later administration. But if the administration sequence began before the abandonment they rely on, and if your grandmother's codicil required a voluntary notarized release you never gave, then this notice may have just put their reliance theory in writing for you." Challenge how? That depends how hard you want to go. I heard my own voice answer before I had time to dress it up. "All the way." He nodded once. "Then stop speaking like a daughter and start speaking like a claimant." I hired him 2 days later. His name was Daniel Mercer. The first useful thing about him was that he found my parents tiresome on sight. The second useful thing was that he knew how to ask for documents in ways that turned polished resistance into deadlines. The letters went out. Requests for accounting, demands for supporting records behind the quiet title filing, notice of potential claims tied to contingent occupancy and proceeds interest, questions regarding counsel knowledge of the codicil language. They responded exactly how people like them always respond at first: coldly, formally, as though I were a tedious emotional misunderstanding wrapped in postage. But pressure changes tone. Within 10 days, Wexler's office amended theirs, still stiff, a less smug. Then came the request for an informal meeting to discuss any misunderstandings. Mercer read that line aloud and looked at me over the page. I laughed. "Misunderstanding," I said. "That's generous." He folded the letter. "It means they want to know how much you know before deciding how scared to be." "Do they know enough yet?" "They know enough to be uncomfortable." Good. Uncomfortable felt honest. Before the meeting, one more person surfaced: Tina Alvarez, former office manager at my father's development company. I remembered her from years ago as the woman who always wore hoop earrings and knew where every file lived, even when the men around her performed confusion as leadership. Marlene had mentioned Tina leaving abruptly in late 2019. I found her through LinkedIn, it then through a bookkeeping business page in Vancouver. At first, she didn't call back. Then she did. We met in a diner off I-5 with sticky menus and pie in a glass case by the register. She ordered coffee and never touched it. "I'm not looking to get dragged into family drama," she said before anything else. "This isn't drama." She held my gaze. "I know," she said. "That's why I called." Tina told me the pressure around Hawthorne in 2019 had been intense. My father wanted what he called clean title flexibility before refinancing part of another deal. My mother kept asking whether Nora's emotional volatility could affect timelines. Colin wanted to know when the duplex could be sold. Tina had once seen a memo from Wexler's office referencing the codicil problem and beneficiary displacement optics. Optics. There it was. Jason, nothing reveals rich panic faster than the word optics. "Did anybody ever say they wanted me pushed out?" I asked. Tina took a slow breath. "Your mother said, and I remember this exactly, if she chooses to turn one disagreement into exile, that is not our wording problem." I stared at her. "She said that?" "Yes. That was my mother with no music under her. Cause harm, then criticize the phrasing." Tina remembered something else too. In July 2019, before I was forced out of the carriage house, a draft internal letter had circulated describing me as self-separated from the family household. That language later vanished. But if Mercer got far enough, the draft history might matter. Might matter. That became the rhythm of the whole thing. And details they thought would never matter enough because I would never stay calm long enough to collect them. By the time the meeting date arrived, I had a binder. A real one. Tabs, copies, notes, cross-references, timeline chart, the kind of organization my mother used to call excessive whenever someone else did it. The meeting took place at Wexler and Bain. Same building, same waxed desk smell, same muted carpet, same false serenity. Mercer sat to my right. Across from us sat Andrew Wexler, late 60s, silver hair, expensive tie, and the expression of a man who had built an entire career out of speaking softly while rearranging other people's futures. My parents sat together on the opposite side, my mother in ivory wool, my father in charcoal, Colin at the end like an accessory. For 1 second, seeing them after 5 years pulled something old through my chest. Not love, not longing, recognition, the body memory of being managed. Then my mother looked at me with the same social smile she used on museum board enemies, and the ache burned off so fast it surprised me. Wexler opened. "We appreciate everyone attending today. in hopes of resolving a misunderstanding regarding historic property administration. Mercer said, "Call it what it is, a disputed rights issue." Wexler folded his hands. "As you wish." My father looked at me and said, "Nora, this never needed to become adversarial." 5 years of silence. That was his first sentence to me. I almost admired the nerve. I said, "You mailed me a document built on a false date and expected me to call that peace?" My mother's smile thinned. "Elise," Wexler said softly, thus without looking at her, as if reminding himself not to let her speak too early. Too late. I had already seen it. The fear. Not loud fear, not shame, calculation fear. The kind that arrives when the other person is not breaking the way you planned. Mercer opened the binder and slid copies across the table. "Let's begin simply," he said. "Your notice asserts Ms. Hawthorne abandoned occupancy and affiliation in August 2019 before subsequent actions affecting Hawthorne property interests. Yet your own traceable record chain shows preparatory transfer activity beginning in June 2019. Wexler did not touch the papers immediately. Mercer kept going. "Further, Ruth Hawthorne's codicil preserved contingent occupancy and precedes rights absent voluntary notarized release in circumstances of intrafamily coercive exclusion. But my client signed no such release." My father leaned back. "This is absurd. Nora left." I turned to him. "No," I said. "I was locked out." Mom said, crisp and flat, "You were impossible." Mercer lifted one hand. "Please don't help my case by characterizing the exclusion as discretionary." That was the first visible crack in my mother's face. Tiny. Enough. Wexler cleared his throat. "The codicil language was subject to interpretation under later trust administration." "By whom?" Mercer asked. "The same office now relying on abandonment language contradicted by earlier drafts?" Colin shifted in his chair. "You don't have earlier drafts." I looked at him. And there he was again, the same boy in a man's suit, unable to stop talking when nervous. Mercer turned his head just slightly. "No?" Colin looked at our father. But my father looked at Wexler. Wexler looked at the table. That was the moment. Not an explosion. Better. A structural crack. I spoke into the silence. "For 5 years, I thought you were quiet because I meant nothing to you." No one answered. I went on. "But silence costs money when you have to maintain it across deeds, filings, private memos, and people who remember dates." My mother said, "Nora, you're being vindictive." I smiled without meaning to. "Vindictive would have been showing up at your Christmas party with copies." She went still. I leaned forward. "You sent me a notice because you thought one more polished threat would finish what the lockout started. But all you actually sent me was proof that after 5 years, you still needed me uninformed." Nobody moved. I could hear the building air system. A faint click in the hallway. Rain brushing the windows again. Wexler finally said, "What outcome is your client seeking?" Mercer answered before I could. "Full accounting. Correction of reliance statements, recognition of preserved contingent interest, negotiation regarding proceeds, occupancy impairment, and associated claims. If not, we proceed." My father let out a bitter laugh. "All this over that duplex?" I looked at him. "No." Silence. Then I finished. "This is over what you did to make it seem like I had no right to ask." That was the center of it. The property mattered. The money mattered. The documents mattered. But the deepest injury had never been the square footage or the sale proceeds. It was what they had tried to lodge inside my body for years, that I had been thrown away because I was too much. Too emotional, too difficult, too sharp. No. I had been inconvenient because I noticed sequence. Wexler asked for a short recess. Mercer agreed. They stepped out into the hall. I stayed in my chair. My hands were cold under the conference room lights, not shaking, just cold. Mercer looked at me and said quietly, "You're doing well." I nodded once. "Am I angry enough?" He gave me a sideways glance. "You're exactly angry enough." When they came back in, the tone had changed. There would be no admission. Of course not. People like my parents treat direct truth like contamination. But there would be numbers, corrections, structure, settlement language, private if possible, quiet if preferred, naturally. They wanted silence professionally repackaged. Mercer negotiated for 2 hours. I watched my parents learn, yet in real time, that the daughter they had pushed out at 26 was not sitting in front of them anymore. Not because I had become harder than they were, because I had become free of needing them to explain themselves. I wrote that line down too. The day I stopped asking for an explanation, they lost their favorite weapon. By the end of the meeting, the framework was there. Revised accounting. Formal acknowledgement of preserved contingent interest. A substantial payout tied to withheld proceeds and occupancy impairment. Correction of statements linked to the quiet title chain. Review of fees. Confidentiality terms, yes, but carefully limited. No language painting me as confused. No spin disguised as closure. My father refused to look at me when he signed the preliminary term sheet. My mother did look at me. But her face was composed, almost beautiful, almost empty. Then she said, "You always did enjoy making things ugly." And finally, after all those years, I answered her right. "No," I said, "I just stopped decorating what you did." She looked away first. That mattered more than the money, though the money mattered too. I used part of the settlement to buy a small townhouse in Selwood with creaky stairs, terrible guest room wallpaper, and a backyard barely large enough for one chair and two planters. The day I got the keys, I sat on the empty living room floor with takeout noodles, the closing folder, and a paper cup of iced tea sweating onto the hardwood beside me. I cried for exactly 4 minutes. Then I stood up and changed the locks. Some endings are loud. Mine was paperwork, rain, and a deadbolt. A few months later, Mercer forwarded the final corrected filings. The record trail had been cleaned up in the only way it could be cleaned without openly naming the rot. But I knew. And more importantly, they knew that I knew. Through Marlene, I heard the Hawthorne duplex sold the following spring under far less glamorous terms than my father had once imagined. Through other people, I heard Colin relocated to Arizona after a refinancing mess. I heard my mother step down from a museum board to focus on family matters, which remains one of the funniest sentences I have ever heard in Oregon. No one from my family contacted me directly after the settlement. That was fine. By then, I understood something I wish I had learned younger. Silence is only power when both people are afraid of it. I wasn't anymore. Last December, I drove past the old house on my way home from Christmas shopping. The lights were up, perfectly symmetrical, warm white, the whole place still looking like a brochure for expensive togetherness. I did not stop. At the red light down the road, I glanced at the passenger seat. Target bags, wrapping paper, a grocery list with clementines, tape, and batteries scribbled on the back. My own mess, my own errands, my own life. Earned, unapproved, mine. The envelope from Wexler and Bain is in a file drawer now. I kept it, not as a wound, as a reminder. For years I thought survival meant waiting for the people who hurt me to finally say something honest. I thought maybe one day they would explain it in a way that made the damage smaller. Maybe one day they would use plain words. But maybe one day they would hand me a truth big enough to live inside. They never were. Honesty was never going to be their gift to me. They sent intimidation instead, polished language, administrative tone, a version of events designed to make me fold under the weight of their formatting. Instead, I read it. I followed the dates. I listened to what the paper admitted by accident. And I laughed. because their final move was so arrogant, it collapsed under its own wording. Because the silence I thought had erased me had actually been built around me. Because while they spent 5 years hiding behind controlled distance, I learned how to hear every small inconsistency they thought no one would ever notice. They put their lie in writing. That was all I needed, and before I leave this here, let me say one thing the way I would if we were sitting across from each other and I knew you understood exactly what kind of family I'm talking about. If you've ever been treated like the problem just because you noticed the pattern. If you've ever been called difficult when all you really were was precise. If you've ever had someone hurt you cleanly enough that other people mistook it for order, then you already know this feeling. So, if this story hit something real for you, like it, subscribe, and stay with me. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where one tiny detail exposed the whole lie? Because sometimes it is not the confession, sometimes it is the date, sometimes that is enough, and sometimes that is everything.